And leaders from around the world have responded to the attacks on those two mosques in Christchurch and the shooting today in Europe. So joining us to discuss that political reaction and fallout from the shootings in New Zealand and the Netherlands is Brittany Andrew Amofa right here in Toronto. Hello, Brittany.
Hello.
And from Ottawa, our freelance columnist Susan Riley. Hello, Susan.
Good morning.
And
good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good evening, in fact.
Good evening, even.
And Summa Strategies Vice Chair Tim Powers. Hello, Tim.
Hey, Aarti.
All right, thank you to all three of you for joining us today. So let's just dig in, and perhaps, Brittany, I'll start with you first. What did you make of how Canada's political leaders reacted to the events on the weekend in Christchurch?
I think we saw an appropriate reaction from our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, as well as the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh. I think the reaction that stood out the most to me in terms of it being really out of place and not, I would say, on mark in terms of what took place was with Andrew Scheer's reaction and his tweet. So not naming Islamophobia or not naming the victims of this tragedy is extremely important. And by not doing so, unfortunately reveals maybe where or how the party feels about this act of terror and how willing are they to distance themselves from white supremacists or those who enact crimes of Islamophobia. So Andrew Scheer's statement stood out the most to me, and I think there's room to question him and some of the figures that he's been standing side by side with in terms of, does he condone Islamophobia? Does he condone acts of terror against Muslim people? Does he condone acts of white supremacy? And until those questions are answered, then he should be under suspicion.
Tim, what do you think? How did those leaders' responses to the attack stand out to you?
I generally agree with Brittany. I think Andrew Scheer got off on the wrong foot. He did not handle it well. I agree with that portion of Brittany's comments. He was not definitive enough. He was not firm enough. You shouldn't equivocate or create the sense that you are equivocating. He did put out a second statement that I thought was more effective and better. I think, again, you have to be clear and definitive when you're talking about these horrible tragedies and who perpetrates them and who the victims are. They shouldn't become tools for political opportunity. I would argue, while the Prime Minister has said the right thing and done the right thing so far, I would suggest to you there's a bit of virtue signaling going on by Liberal members of Parliament as well here too, and none of that is good, but I will credit the Prime Minister in his words, the politics aside, of being clear and definite. I didn't see Mr. Singh's commentary, but I've seen there's been no criticism of what he said, which has been unusual for Mr. Singh, because as you know, he's gotten himself in trouble when issues have been more complex and on foreign shores.
Now, Susan, before I get you to weigh in, I do want to quickly play for our viewers what we know the Prime Minister said today in question period, his reaction again to those attacks. And some people interpreted it as a bit of a sort of veiled criticism or jab towards Andrew Scheer. So let's quickly take a listen to what Justin Trudeau had to say.
I'm calling on like-minded countries of the world to stand with Canada in this fight. Muslim, Christian, Jewish, black, white, all of us, we must fight this hatred as a team that refuses to accept this as the new normal, a team tired of sending thoughts and prayers.
All right, so Susan, who is Justin Trudeau speaking to in that?
Well, earlier on, he called on politicians. He basically said we politicians have failed to stand up to white supremacists and to other forms of hate groups. And he said, whenever we see it, we've got to confront it at town halls, at demonstrations. I mean, those were clearly jabs aimed at Andrew Scheer, I would say. The Prime Minister. His message has been consistent, though. He's always sort of said this. I think he truly believes in diversity and mutual tolerance, and love is better than hate. I do believe that comes from his core.
Do you think,
but
Susan,
he's also using it politically too.
Do you think, Susan, it's just Andrew Scheer, or do you think he's also directing that towards, let's say, the U.S. president, who had an interesting reaction too?
I believe there was a mild swipe at Trump, and he's also, I think, targeting Maxime Bernier, who, unique among federal leaders here in Canada, has refused to say anything about the bombings, or the massacre in New Zealand. Saying that these are just kind of empty words, really. What can we do to change anything or to help? I'm not going to join the chorus of, politically correct empty words, although he did 2 years ago express condolences when a number of Christians were attacked in a similar incident. So, but he's playing to his own audience,
Aarti,
too.
can I pick up on that? I think Susan's hitting
Sure.
on something really interesting here. Max Bernier's been a disgrace on this front. I mean, lives have been lost. I know I have lots of friends in New Zealand, maybe my co-panelists do as well. They're of all sorts of faiths. This is really hitting that country hard, as a similar massacre, God forbid, were it to happen in Canada would. This isn't the time to have a debate about what's politically correct or not politically correct. If you're a human being and you have a degree of compassion and you're a leader, you need to speak to all of this. I think Susan's right. Your question is a good one. Is this targeted at Trump? Most certainly it is. And why is that the case? Well, he's an easy target, and Trudeau is trying to recharge his brand a little bit because he's been subject, as we know, and we'll talk about it in our next segment, to some criticism about him truly being progressive, truly standing for the things he said he would stand for. So Trudeau has always been traditionally good on the projection of values and juxtaposing that with Trump. So, of course, he's using this as a political opportunity, and he should be called out for that, to do just that again.
The thing about Scheer, though, that still puzzles me is, his first response was, freedom is under attack in New Zealand. And I thought, freedom? I thought Muslims are under attack in New Zealand. Like, what does that mean, even? And, of course, then he went on to talk about peaceful worshipers, again, not naming them. There was an uproar online, and he got a lot of negative feedback, including, I think, from other conservatives. And so he sort of changed, he put out a more forceful statement.
He had a second updated statement, and we should point out, too, that perhaps, and you guys have all brought up Scheer's sort of 3 statements, perhaps, that have come out, because the third time's a charm, I guess. He spoke today in question period, and perhaps we'll just quickly also play that clip, because it is a little bit different from what we heard.
Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, the words we say today are important, but words today are not enough. We must commit today to turn words into concrete action. Action to defend a concept of Canada rooted in shared civic values, respect for the principle of universal human dignity, and freedom of religion for all. We must fight terrorism. We must stand with our Muslim brothers and sisters, people of all faiths, people of all racial backgrounds.
So perhaps some would say caving to pressure there, or perhaps something was made a little bit clearer to him by his team that he did need to specifically call out the victims in that case. And that's something, of course, Brittany, that you also mentioned. But I do want to talk about world leaders as well. And for example, there was an Australian politician, Fraser Anning, a senator, and he essentially, in his comments, blamed Muslim immigration for the attack in Christchurch. And he faced criticism, no question, and actually had an egg cracked on his head. We have some tape of that to share with our viewers here of what exactly happened.
When people are getting attacked in their own...
All right, so that was just a little clip of that. Certainly it went viral. But what does that sort of reaction from an Australian citizen towards a politician, what does it say of people's expectations of how they would like politicians to react when facing a crisis or a situation like this? Brittany.
Well, first I do want to say I don't condone violence at any point, even when the words that somebody is saying is abhorrent. So I do want to put that out there. But in regards to the Australian elected official, it's quite disappointing. In this moment, it's very easy to use racialized people, Muslims, etc., as scapegoats for what the problem really is. And the problem is that there isn't enough attention or resources dedicated to interrogating right-wing terrorism in a lot of the Western world. Canada is guilty of it, of this ourselves, and we need to ensure that the amount of attention that we give to other forms of terrorism, we need to be giving that attention and more to right-wing terrorism as well. So that sort of rhetoric that is coming from this Australian elected official is quite disappointing, and it's actually racist. By blaming Muslims for their own demise is extremely damaging. It's a narrative that actually perpetuates further violence against this group and community, and it actually leads to a downward spiral that does not address or even put forward solutions. So I hope that that is standing the test of scrutiny right now in Australia, and that should be used as an example of what not to say and how to not further demonize a group that just faced extreme tragedy.
I'd call it hate speech myself, and I never know how to deal with this as a journalist or just as a citizen. On the one hand, you don't want hateful people to go covert, to go silent. In some senses, I think it's better to be shocked by people, to know exactly where they stand. But I say that as a person who's not a racial minority, obviously, and therefore, I can't be hurt by their words. So I honestly wrestle with this all the time.
Except, Aarti, there's a bigger problem here, right? We have it in North America. It's happening all over the world. And it's not just that senator, but it typifies where that senator gets a constituency of voters. He's playing off people's fear, lack of education and awareness about what's actually happening with immigration, their own concerns about their economic future. And we see this in Canada to a large degree, and it's not just on the right. Those on the left, as I used the phrase earlier, virtue signal sometimes, and it works for both polemics in attracting voters. And it's just wrong on both sides. I mean, the reason we have such anxiety and tensions is because politicians like that senator in Australia, go out and reinforce arguments that are not factually accurate about why something happened. And Australia, like Canada, is having some fierce immigration debates as the makeup of the society changes. The older traditional inhabitants of the land age. They worry about their own economic security. But what I've just said to you is boring. It's easier to pick on somebody's ethnicity and alleged myths about their action than it is to get into details about why people are anxious.
Exactly it.
And now I do have one final question I want to ask you guys. We are running out of time, so I'll ask for a quick response to this. We know that, of course, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, her response to this attacks is maybe perhaps some would call set a standard or set an example of how a leader can respond. We know that she emphasized inclusivity, for example, in her statement saying, "You may have chosen us to the attacker. We utterly reject and condemn you," moving swiftly to announce changes to gun laws and very clearly opposing those sorts of views that are out there, and making sure that she was very clear on where she stands and where she believes the country stands. So do we believe that she is setting the new political standard on how one should respond when in leadership to this sort of an event? I'll go to you, Brittany.
I don't know if it's a new standard. I felt like that was what I would expect, to be honest. I think it's the appropriate response. You know what? When I hear things like we're going to change gun laws, it shouldn't take a massacre to interrogate and to look at our gun laws. So that's why it wasn't anything that stood out greatly to me. I think she's doing a wonderful job, and I think she's really holding her country together at this moment in time. But I think we need to really question further around why does it take a massacre for us to interrogate or look at gun laws? And how are we ensuring that this rhetoric around diversity and inclusion and hate speech is done all year round? It just can't occur in moments of tragedy. So that's how I kind of view it.
And the most important thing is that there be some follow-up. Let's check in another month or so and see if, in fact, the gun regime in New Zealand has changed. Yeah. I think that her response was striking and admirable because it's so unusual in the age of Trump. I mean, Trump has lowered the bar. And there's no question that his rhetoric, his attitudes have fed a lot of the hate that is also spilling over our border. So she's an antidote, at least, to Trump.
And just quickly, as you said, I mean, Obama used to be very good, sadly, at giving these grief speeches. And if we all probably remember the horror of Sandy Hook, and I think very similar in line with what Jacinda Ardern said in New Zealand, what's changed in America? The speeches are great. The approach is great in terms of responding in the moment. Even our own Prime Minister said that today. What are the outcomes we want from these words?
Well, all three of you, Brittany, Susan, Tim, thank you for weighing in on this topic. We know we have plenty more to discuss coming up.